So I'll begin with some introductory remarks to put event in context. The ECA and ODI initiated a joint research program on Brexit last year following the UK referendum result. The program is part of a broader partnership between ECA and ODI funded by the UK Department for International that is supportive of Africa's development. And this will be the focus of Max's presentation today. The third paper will highlight lessons learned from the EPAs, of which I shall talk briefly in these remarks in a few moments. And then we plan two further papers relating to standards and rules of origin, and one that takes stock of the main findings of the other papers and identifies what a comprehensive Africa-UK trade partnership would look like. We've also held a number of Africa Brexit events similar to this one to share the findings of our joint research, to raise the profile of Africa on the UK trade policy agenda, and to encourage constructive and progressive thinking and debate on what the future UK-Africa trade partnership could look like. And these include roundtable events that have actually taken place at ODI itself in London. The Seychelles, Gambia, Kenya, Equatorial Guinea, Zambia, Rwanda, and South Africa accounted for more than one-fifth of the EU exports went to the UK alone. The UK accounts for 67%, 41%, 31%, and 22% of Africa's exports to the EU of beef, tea and spices, wine, and fruit, respectively. So in this context, Brexit has raised legitimate concerns in African countries, particularly those from the Commonwealth. Market access to the UK has been through preferential EU arrangements. The majority of African countries have duty-free, quota-free access through the EBA scheme, and the rest benefit from other preferential access. What potential market access lost from Brexit but there is potential market access loss from Brexit, as there is currently no certainty over the post-Brexit arrangements. So it is therefore a considerable threat to African countries that are reliant on UK markets. This highlights the urgent need to ensure that at the very least, the continuation of existing UK market access for African countries. Now, lessons that we have learned from the EPAs, and this is one of the papers that I mentioned that we are working on. So to solve this issue of market access continuation, an option is to replicate the UK, the EPAs. In fact, the UK government, through the white paper preparing for a future UK trade policy, has expressed its intention to replicate the terms of trade currently established through the EU third country GSP and free trade areas, including the EPAs. This has been justified based on the need for continuity and a smooth transition for business continuity both in the UK and for its partners. So while this is unquestionable, while it is unquestionable that it is a priority to avoid disruption in trade arrangements. In the case of the EPAs, a simple replication of existing arrangements may not be beneficial for either party, so there is need to exercise caution. The EPAs, as we all know, have been mired in controversy, particularly as the development benefits are concerned. In some regions, the pace of negotiations has been very slow and overall implementation remains limited. And parallel to the EPAs, the African countries have embarked on negotiations for an agreement to establish the Continental Free Trade Area. The December 2017 deadline for completion of the first phase of the negotiations on trading goods and trading services has been met, pending nominal technical work. An extraordinary AU summit is envisaged before the end of March 2018 to complete and sign the entire CFTA agreement. This substantial change in the African trade dynamics was not foreseen at the time when the negotiations for the EPAs were launched. With this in mind, the African Union Commission and the ECA have put forward a proposal for a standstill on the EPA process to allow for the conclusion of the negotiations on the CFTA. The standstill will serve as a pause in the EPA negotiation and signature processes. So during this time, partners would continue with legal commitments and obligations and ongoing initiatives on investment and capacity support, but no additional commitments would be introduced. The CFTA is the priority for African countries in terms of trade policy reform. This is where Africa's focus should be right now. To date, the EPAs are still largely unimplemented, while the first stage of the CFTA negotiations is, as we've said, just being concluded. There is therefore a strong case for the strategic sequencing of these agreements and a standstill in the EPA process until the finalization of the CFTA. This wouldn't represent a large change from the current situation and at the same time would not introduce new compatibility issues as could happen if the remaining agreements were concluded and implemented in an uncoordinated manner. Once established, the CFTA will also make African countries better positioned to move towards a harmonized relationship with the EU through a consolidated and coherent single Africa-EU asymmetrical trade agreement, an Africa-wide EPA, in other words, with the EU. So this proposal is ECA has shown that while EPAs result in trade gains for both EU and African countries, the gains are larger for EU partners and the benefits to African countries focus on non-LDCs and a few non-industrial sectors. EPAs would also have a negative effect on inter-African trade through trade diversion. However, implementing the CFTA before the full implementation of the EPAs would, through enhanced inter-African trade, offset these negative impacts. Gains to the EU would be largely preserved. Inter-African trade also has great potential to facilitate economies of scale, diversification and value addition. According to ECA's recent report on transforming African economies through smart trade and industrial policy, in 2014, manufactured goods accounted for 41.9% of inter-African trade exports, inter-African exports, compared with only 14.8% of Africa's exports outside the continent. Further research on the provisions of EPAs has also pointed to differences between the agreements which may serve to limit regional value chain development, most notably between the incompatibility between the various cumulation provisions under the agreement's rules of origin. It is also expected that these differences will need to be harmonized in the future as part of the regional and integration process, leading to the need to reopen some provisions for negotiations. So let me just end by throwing out some ideas on designing a pro-development Africa-UK trade partnership, and then Max would be able to pick up from these remarks in his presentation. So against this background that I've just outlined on the difficulties that the EPAs faced in a practical way, as well as the potential that we see in the CFTA. So against this background, the proposal to replicate the EPAs as they are for the relationship between African countries and the UK appears less appealing. A transitional arrangement will be required to ensure continuity in preferences post-Brexit. However, a rushed EPA-like trade agreement would miss the opportunity to address the known shortcomings of the agreement and the new trade environment both in Africa and in Europe. A new and improved post-Brexit preferences regime should be designed. The first step is to roll over the current market access arrangements that African countries have through the EU to ensure continuity. The second step is to develop a transitional trade regime that targets Africa as a whole. The transitional regime could last up to 2025. Joint ODI ATPC research recommends a unilateral preferential scheme available to both African LDCs and non-LDCs, as well as all qualifying developing countries, but designed to address African issues. So I would more or less stop here and let Max take over from here, but just in concluding my own introductory remarks, just to say that urgent action is really required also from the African side, because the window for informing the UK government's decisions on its future trade partnership with Africa is rapidly closing. The new Trade and Customs Bill and the White Paper on Trade already lay out plans for UK trade with developing countries, including Africa. The current intention of the UK government is to continue with EPAs. So this requires quick and coordinated action from Africa. In this context, the AU Trade Commissioner has been requested to hold discussions with the UK authorities on Brexit, for among other reasons to ensure coherence between the position on the EPA standstill and the post-Brexit Africa-UK trade relationship. So these are my own introductory remarks. And so we move on now to the second part of event here today, which is to ask Max to make his presentation. So Max, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Arjun, I'm here at home. We will have to speak, so I will leave any tips about restaurants or anything. Basically, the idea of my presentation is trying to be a bit more specific on how to basically step up the relationship between the UK and Africa, specific after Brexit. And specifically, I will talk about a potential preferential regime that can be established by the UK. I'm going to start from the beginning, that basically this is a sort of an alternative, this is a sort of the options. There is a lot of the UK that is planning or is expecting to do in terms of stepping up the relationship with Africa. This is one option on that, but clearly it's something that comes from a big debate that exists nowadays in the UK about the trade policy of the UK. The referendum of 2016 basically triggered that discussion. So if you have been in the UK in the last year and a half, you have become a specialist about customs union and single market, because everyone talks about that. But basically, the UK trade policy after Brexit could be characterized in a very caricature, basically a very simplistic way, with two potential scenarios. One would be these scenarios, these two flavors, basically. One would be a soft Brexit type of a scenario. That will mean that the single market membership and the customs union remain. This sort of thing has been seen to be the short run, because there seems to be a sort of transition that will include these elements. But basically what this would mean, that there will not be significant changes in terms of the trade policy of the UK with respect to the current EU trade policy. The hard Brexit scenario is a scenario where actually triggers very significant changes in terms of policy. That means the no membership of the customs union. I mean, it's very important that being out of the EU, the UK will no longer be a member of the customs union, because you had to be a member of the EU to be part of the customs union. They could have to form a customs union with the EU eventually. Basically, in the short run, we can sort of see a soft Brexit scenario. It's very important to hear that these options may be changing permanently. There is a lot of debate. I mean, there are developments in policy in the UK that may make any of these options more likely in terms of policy. Basically, in addition to the sort of debate about the trade policy, there have been a huge and important debate in terms of trade policy to promote development in the UK. What the UK can do to foster that support. And this is particularly key for Africa because the UK is a key development partner for Africa, and it's part, this economic development strategy is part of the DFID economic development strategy. So it's at the core of the development strategy of the UK, the economic development and the trade aspect. For many African countries, David made brought some numbers, the UK remains a very important export destination. So for example, for Kenya, it destinates 9% of its exports are going to the UK. At the same time, Africa is in a process that David has mentioned of reformulating its trade policy to align with some general policy objectives that we can characterized in two sort of elements. One, there is a strong emphasis in terms of fostering intracontinental trade, which the CFTA is part of approaches to that. That creates a sort of potential trade aversion scenario in Africa that Africa needs to address. And also is the industrialization strategy, the development of the manufacturing sector is a very important, I would say, key component of the economic transformation strategy. So just to bring some numbers on how important would be the removal of the preferential access that currently these countries has to in the UK. Basically for Africa, that will mean, in average, would mean a fall of exports of 2.6%. That may not be big, but for some countries, such as Namibia, Swaziland, Mauritius, there could be an important effect in terms of their exports. So basically, the idea is try to advance as the UK changes policy and try to design a strategy building on foundations that could establish this relationship. Avoiding the cliff edge, basically, March 2019, that is the Brexit day, is basically urgent, but clearly it's not sufficient. So clearly there are commitments from the UK actually to step up on that, and that would be a sort of a minimum to achieve. And basically, this sort of idea of trying to, in the short run, trying to address market access, securing the operation of the value chains involved in the EU, the UK, and Africa is very important. But then there are opportunities to step up around improving market access, better rules of origin, addressing standards, and particularly the compliance, and then developing long-term trade relationships. So basically, it could be established a sort of roadmap in terms of the relationship with Africa. So what is basically the approach to avoid the cliff edge? This is key to secure that countries, African countries, are not affected in the short run. So basically, there is an aim to continue the current market access provisions, where basically there is a 425 million of African exports that depends on the access to the UK market. And as I said, securing the operation of the logistic arrangements between the EU, the UK, and Africa. This seems to be guaranteed secure in the transitional period, because the UK will remain as part of what is negotiated, what has been public, I mean, aiming to having a transitional period that may extend beyond 2019. So basically what the UK government is proposing, is aiming at, has announced, is basically continuing the current EBA arrangements for LDCs and the GSP that will be rolled over, and renew existing free trade agreements with the EU, including the EPA. This is, it is not basically, it's not sufficient, it is the aim is trying to step up the relationship. There is an issue associated with that the UK has a smaller market share in Africa than the EU, so any agreement with these countries would generate trade diversion for African countries. And at the same time, EPAs affect the regional and the continental integration, so in that sense, that may be an issue. But also, there is an opportunity here that we could that could be taken to improve commitments and align them to the African development objectives. So basically, what to do basically to improve the strategy and to move the cliff edge? Well, basically, the UK is in a position right now that it cannot actually modify the terms of the EPAs, cannot negotiate or improve them. And actually, any sort of change of the current arrangement will take time, and this is not what is available. So clearly, in terms of rolling over any different type of arrangement in a short run will not be feasible. However, once the cliff edge is avoided, there is a lot of things that we can be different alternatives. A preferential regime is an option. That will have important implications, for example, in terms of rules of origin. It will allow cumulation wide Africa and actually with other developing countries. And it will provide a basis for a wider and potentially reciprocal UK-African engagement. So basically, a unilateral preferential regime could be thought actually to as the post-Brexit relationship, with the aim that target the benefit to the poorest countries and to provide benefits in terms of rules of origin. It is important that this regime must be available, will be available to all developing countries, not just African countries. However, preferences, we like to highlight, remain a controversial tool. They generate negative incentives, so basically it needs to be thought as a sort of a medium-term strategy with the aim that in that process Africa will be in position of adopting a more reciprocal trade-off approach. In terms of reviewing preferential regimes, there are different, there are big differences among preferential regimes in terms of country coverage in the different countries, so limiting to LDCs, including all developing countries, and different ways of selecting beneficiaries, and also the criteria that you use. So from very objective criteria to actually, for example, the American GSP regime, that actually it has some very strong discretionary elements. But what would be the ideal characteristics of this regime? One thing is that it should target the benefits. So we need to understand that preferences for everyone are preferences for no one. It may require some sort of discrimination if we want to do this within developing countries. For example, the EU uses some competitiveness criteria to select members of the GSP+. Specifically on Africa, it should aim to provide market access to non-LDCs, such as Kenya and Ghana. It should also consider the situation of the small island states, and that in base of their limited diversification capacity, they may need some support. No country, African or non-African, should be worse off with respect to the EU current arrangement. It should be a simple regime, ideally a two-tier regime. It could be rolled out under the enabling clause. I mean, that would be something that would be okay. And basically something special for Africa, such as a LAGOA type of preferences, is likely that would be challenged. So this is a sort of option that it probably should be rolled out. So the regime, the idea would have a two-tier regime, a general regime available to all low-income and lower middle-income countries, as defined by the World Bank. Additional criteria could be included to consider some small island states. However, according to the definition, sometimes that includes some high-income countries. No country is worse off. So, for example, in this sense, countries such as India or Vietnam or Indonesia will remain covered in the general regime. all African countries will be covered. The only exception will be South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. However, they have, and actually there have been discussions with the UK government to actually extending the current arrangement, bilateral arrangements that exist. So actually, this is a solution that seems to be working for them. And it will provide, for example, improved market access for Nigeria, something like that. The idea is the benefits of this tier will the benefit will be restricted in this general regime with the aim of giving the full benefits to the targeted regime. That it will be the beneficiaries of the general regime that meeting some vulnerability criterion or such as in the GSP plus, they will qualify for the targeted regime that will offer duty-free, quota-free market access in all products. It will have, as I said, the products on the general regime would be restricted, so some agricultural products and textiles and clothing will be included in the targeted regime but excluded on the general, so basically the benefits will be targeted to this regime. All LDCs would be included. If we use a similar type of criteria as the GSP plus, countries such as Kenya, Ghana, or Egypt would be included in this regime. Cape Verde and other GSP plus countries, not necessarily African countries, will see an improvement in market access in the way that this is designed. So basically, this is a general and a targeted regime. And just to summarize, basically, avoiding the cliff edge is a sort of priority in the relationship with Africa and UK. Extending the current GSP provisions and the rolling over of EPAs is based on the time available, is the safest and the fastest option to advance. But actually, I think it's necessary to start thinking of how to move forward on the agenda. Specifically, I will talk about Brexit plus one. A preferential regime like the one I have sketched could constitute an option because it will facilitate accumulation in terms of rules of origin, Africa-wide and other regions. And it will target countries with significant large pockets of poverty. Some countries that may be excluded on other arrangements, but still with where poverty and trade can contribute to that. This is a sort of a regime of a sort of medium-term solution for Africa trade. We need to understand that the UK will negotiate free trade agreements with many other regions, so any preferential regime, the benefits of those preferential regimes will be eroded over time. So clearly, in the long run, it's necessary to think of a different type of relationship, including with some elements of reciprocity, including probably the continent as a whole, but also including issues associated with services, with investment, etc., that are very important for Africa actually to deliver its development objectives. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Max. And now I'll turn to discussants to provide some perspective on what you have shared with us in regard to, firstly, avoiding a cliff edge, secondly, designing a GSP scheme in a general and targeted way, and then thirdly, moving towards a longer-term arrangement with Africa. So I'll start with Chiedu Osakwe. Chiedu, you are currently chairing the, as I said in my introduction, the African Continental Free Trade Area talks. And you've heard these options that have been rolled out here this morning. How does that look to you, firstly, in your role in the CFTA, and then secondly, you know, wearing your other hat as Nigeria's chief trade negotiator?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, David, and thanks to you and to UNECA for your leadership on trade policy matters in Africa. Max, thank you very much for that presentation. As I was listening to this, my mind was going through lots of things. One, Max, is the mechanics that you have proposed, or rather designed, for the redesign of UK trade policy. That is one. I've looked at the details. I'll give you comments on that in a few minutes. But what probably I'd like to do in terms of responding to David's question would be to put a number of satellites, if you like. Look at this as an orbit, what you have described. At the center of this orbit is your suggested design of UK trade policy. Now, I'd like to configure a number of satellites around it. One would be the global trade policy landscape. Another satellite would be the United Kingdom as a democracy, as one of the oldest democracies in the world. The third would be what's going on in the continental free trade area negotiations. The other would be what's happening in the global trade policy landscape. And you touched on some of them. You didn't touch on Asia. You touched on the United States and AGOA. And then the last would be the substance, the largest substance of trade policy beyond preferences and GSP schemes. I think it's important. I mean, the United Kingdom is there. It's one of the oldest democracies in the world. It stands for a lot in the global economy. There is a tradition. I read your paper again. It has a historic relationship with many African countries. And so whatever we are proposing, consultants, UNECA, Nigerians, South Africans, the African Union Commission. We also have to give some scope and some margin to the United Kingdom as a democracy with its own internal politics and its own internal dynamics, and respect that as well. And there's a bit of uncertainty to it. The results from democratic processes are never really apparent. And sometimes democracies produce that are more complicated and difficult to apply. And so the conclusion from this first point that I put in is that we're not dealing with a situation that is formulaic. We're dealing with a variable in a rapidly changing scenario. And I think we all have to understand that. The second is to look at what's going on in our continent. And David, my friend and brother, has elaborated on this to a large extent. We're building a single market for trade in goods and services in stage 1. And then we will move to a stage 2 for investment, competition policies, and intellectual property. What's the sense in what we're doing? Basically, the sense in what we're doing, I mean, there's a beautiful piece in The Economist of this week, and I think it's useful to look at. But to a large extent, what African countries, 55 of us, are trying to do is to reverse an aspect of colonial legacy, and mark my words, an aspect of it of fragmented markets, in which African economies were designed not to trade with themselves, but their economies were designed to supply primary commodities, and commodities to which value was never added. And so there are internal dynamics within Africa, with 55 countries, with 7 regional economic communities. The dynamics have been triggered, but we're not entirely sure how this is going to play out. But what we have in our head is that we will drive this with strength and purpose and determination to do what? To establish a single market, to integrate manufacturing structures, to reduce dependence, diversify our economies, modernize them, reduce trade policy dependence on preferences. Actually reduce dependence on preferences, because in many ways preferences are yesterday's trade policies, unless they are within regional markets. In other words, if we have a CFTA, and we will have a CFTA, what Nigeria gives to South Africa, it would have to give to 53 other African countries. And so we have to say, is my second reason, we have to start thinking about preferences in a slightly different way. In terms of what the CFTA would like to achieve, and not the colonial type preferences, but preferences within regional markets, like what we're trying to create within the CFTA, that makes our economies more autonomous, more independent, more diversified, more modernized, and better integrated into the global economy. Third point I'd like to make on this, and we've talked about the UK and its democracy, and we've talked about the CFTA and what we're trying to do. Now we have to go to the other level, the starting level, and that is the level of the domestic economy. Structural reforms, domestic policy reforms, absolutely vital. And so I don't really want to speak here as a Nigerian, but a Nigerian lesson here which is yielding results. An enabling environment for business, good governance, rule of law. Nigeria has just been moved up 24 places on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business. And so the point I'm making here is that we also have to think about the new Africa-UK relationship that we're trying to redesign in terms of a balance of rights and obligations. There has to be an element of good citizenship in modern trade relationships, just as you have it domestically, constitutionally. Forget international trade. Just think of the domestic setting, constitutional setting. If you pay your taxes, you will be entitled to light, water, security, garbage cleaning. A lot of this is based on a balance of rights and obligations. So preserve market access, I agree with Max. Avoid the cliff edge, I agree. Smooth it out, but there's a bigger picture. Domestic structural reforms. You have to build the internal market. It's not just about the market of the others. It can't be. It can't be. If it were, and if it continues, then we'll never be out of this classical rot of exporting primary commodities. And so there's a huge chunk of an agenda of domestic structural reforms. Summarize them. Services. The Nigerians are not doing very badly. Entertainment, banking, financial services, the digital economy, market empowerment of women and the informal sector. These are as important, if not more important, than preferences. 70% of Nigeria's economy is informal. Think about that. Domestic market restrictions. The Nigerians are making a bold move. They are moving aggressively, and the results are showing very positively. But as we think about preferences and think about external markets, in a changing global economy, the lesson and the message must be build domestic markets, deepen regional integration, push ahead aggressively and robustly on the continental free trade area. And here again, endless tribute to the African Union Commission, lots of tribute to David and his team at UNECA. They're doing fabulous work. We go back, and let me conclude because I know that our time is limited, but we're running from one thing to the other. There's a lot that's going on globally. There's uncertainty, there's backlash against globalization. Trade is not what it used to be as a share of GDP since 1947, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis. There are lots of disruptions. A lot of it is coming from technology, not actually from trade. And technology, according to the latest reports, look at Christine Lagarde's recent presentation at Harvard. A lot of the driving force for economic growth now is almost as much, if not a little bit more, from technology. Digital economy, e-commerce, financial services, fintech, financial technology. And so we have to pitch this wider. And so to conclude, huge appreciation to Max for what he's done. But you have to put this in a universe. You have to put all this in a universe. It's not just as simple as saying this is how it should be designed. Hardly a few points I disagree with in there, by the way, but that's hardly the point in my view. There is a universe that's in dynamic transition and rotation, if you like, and we must figure all this out, not just hanker about preferences with another trading partner, but also about preferences within our regional markets and the things that we have to do domestically. And I'm quite happy to elaborate on this, but I'll hand it back to my brother, the moderator.
No, thank you for that. Brendan, the Commonwealth can be described as a satellite in Chiedu's orbit, very important part of this universe that Chiedu has elaborated a bit on. Now, what would be your perspective on what Max has outlined in relation to this very staged transition to a less to a trade regime that is not based on preferences? Also, perhaps you could comment on Chiedu's point that preferences are yesterday's trade policy solutions.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, David, for the invitation here. Maybe just as a starting point to say something about the Commonwealth, for those who are not familiar. The Commonwealth is an association of 52 sovereign countries representing around 2.4 billion people around the world, and Sub-Saharan Africa is our largest geographical grouping. So I think it's a great pleasure to be here with 18 member states from Sub-Saharan Africa in the Commonwealth and sharing some thoughts around the future UK partnership. Before getting to your questions, David, since Ambassador Osakwe is here, I've come armed with an African proverb. And I think that's a very important starting point when one talks about the opportunities and challenges facing Africa in relation to Brexit. And that's when two elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. And I think to some extent this is what we're seeing with the grass being trampled directly and indirectly at the Commonwealth Secretariat. We've done some work looking at the implications of Brexit, both the challenges, but also looking at the opportunities. And I think this is should be the focus of our discussion, is the way forward, the importance of preferences for Africa and the opportunities. But it would be amiss not to recognize that some of the grass is being trampled through reduced export earnings, remittances and aid resulting from the depreciation of the pound, And I think also with the lower growth prospects that the UK is facing, this could impact on the demand for goods and services coming from Africa. It's very interesting that Mark Carney from the Bank of England describes Brexit as a very unique example of deglobalization in the short term. I think I agree with Max in terms of some of the, the costs that could be raised by Brexit facing sub-Saharan African exporters to the UK in terms of MFN tariffs, preference erosion standards. That very important issue, I think, which often goes amiss is the disruption of supply chains, where many African exporters of fruit, horticulture and floriculture basically export to the UK via Belgium and the Netherlands. So I think that is an important issue that we need to look at. Going forward, I think, overall in terms of setting this partnership, one important aspect is the future UK-EU partnership, which would probably be the deciding factor in conditioning this overall partnership between Africa and the UK. I think, the end point is unknown.
No problem at all. I think you can squeeze by. Yes, just yeah. Good to see you, man.
Once you'll be yeah, careful, water. Yeah, okay.
No worries. I'll just continue. I think the end point around that is still very unknown. And I think even the regulatory model and the trade standard that will underpin the UK's future trade policy will also be a deciding factor. We've had a lot of discussions around certain trade standards that are deemed protectionist, for instance, like citrus black spot. Will the UK have the opportunity to rescind or review that in light of continuing regulatory alignment with its largest trading partner, which will be the UK? I would also just say that I think a second overall conditioning factor is that this UK-Africa partnership could build on the UK's undisputed role and commitment in supporting trade and development and supporting regional integration in Africa. The UK is one of the few high-income countries to meet its 0.7% commitment to international development assistance. It's consistently had the highest level of aid for trade disbursements to Africa through multilateral channels. That's the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Been a significant contributor to aid for trade at the bilateral level, around $800 million in 2014. Through DFID, the UK has participated in key regional integration programs and trade facilitation programs. So looking forward, I think what can the Commonwealth do, and the importance of preferences, to answer David's question. I think I agree with Ambassador Osakwe that preferences do remain important for many African countries as they start to climb the value, try to climb the ladder of value addition and structurally transform. This can't be the end-all and the be-all of trade policy, and I think one has to look at those trade reforms around spurring competitiveness, looking at infrastructure investment, building private sector and entrepreneurialism, especially women and youth entrepreneurs. Around 60% of the Commonwealth citizens are under the age of 30 years, so we do need to provide opportunities for these entrepreneurs going forward. There are, perhaps I should say that the Commonwealth is also not a trading bloc, but there are substantial opportunities for growing trade and investment among Commonwealth countries, both in Africa and without Africa. We have seen through some of our econometric work that we've done that there's a 19% cost advantage to being a Commonwealth member state, and I think that's an opportunity that countries can build on going forward. I think in terms of the broader partnership, given the constraints of the WTO rules around what kind of a partnership could be built, it might be important to look beyond trade and be looking at a more, a partnership for prosperity with African countries. I think there's a general recognition that, the economic partnership agreements have not accommodated Africa's development concerns. And perhaps if one even looks back now at the recent G20 action plan on Africa, Germany's proposal for a new Europe-Africa Marshall Plan, if you like, I think it does tend to hit some of the right notes in terms of an emphasis on more on fair trade rather than free trade, more private investment, ending harmful exports to Africa, the use of strategic tariff policy to buffer global competition, financial systems and inclusive financial inclusion, value chain development, bottom-up economic development, jobs and employment. So perhaps those are some of the right notes that this future partnership can start looking at, and perhaps draw some opportunities and lessons from that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you very much, Brendan. I'm beginning to sense convergence in the thoughts that have been presented by Max, and response from Chiedu and also from Brendan. And we've now been joined by the Honorable Minister of Trade of Uganda, Amelia Kyambadde, whom I had introduced in her absence. Minister, we've just been discussing how the UK, when it leaves the EU, would avoid a disruption to trade with its partners, including the African countries. And then we've been looking beyond that to see how in the short to medium term the UK could design a trade policy that would build upon the preferential arrangements within the EU, but then go beyond that to recognize how Africa itself is changing, the trade policy coherence that we expect to come out of the continental free trade area. And as I've just said, the two colleagues, Ambassador Chiedu, Osakwe, whom you know very well, chairing the CFTA negotiations, and Brendan Vickers from the Commonwealth Secretariat, who was speaking as you entered, I've just been saying that I see some convergence in the thinking that this is a great opportunity to respond to Africa's needs, to respond to the way that the 21st century trade landscape is changing. So, Minister, the question I guess I'll like to put to you is how does all of this look from your point of view, not only in Uganda, but also in the East African community? I'm aware that you are currently the chair of the East African Community Trade Ministers. Obviously, you're also interested in ensuring market access continuity in the short term, but then moving beyond that, as you yourself is one of the architects of trade policy on the continent of the CFTA, how do you see the relationship developing from the short term to the medium to long term?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to apologize to the panel and the people for there was a bit of miscoordination about the address. I started my journey at 7:30, but I'm glad at least I found the forum here. I do apologize for that. Well, I'd like to thank you for organizing this session. UK and Uganda have had a long relationship, way back from the 50s. And the relationship was premised also on diplomatic, but also on commercial entities. We have been doing trade in various fora, as UK, as bilaterals, but even when UK joined EU, we continued on the basis of the provisions that were provided by EU. Trade between Uganda and UK has had a bit of decline, I must admit, because of a number of reasons. Of course, there were the global shocks, the fluctuation of the dollar, and decline in commodity prices, and uncertainty about the Brexit process, because it took a while people were negotiating to exit. So where do we want to go from here? Because that's why we're here. Does Africa have a future with UK? I thought about this issue and I put down a number of points. Number one, we should not overlook the issue of regional trade, because it has become a very big game changer in the African economies. So trading with organized economic blocs in Africa is worthwhile. It's very important. If UK engaged EAC, SADC, Ecowas, Now we have CFTA, which is in progress, and we are sure that we're going to be very successful in managing it. We've been very cautious about the provisions of the laws that we put in place. So it is important that UK starts looking at these regional blocks. But it must not roll back the gains we already had with the UK while we were in EU. And we must have commercially meaningful, duty-free, quota-free market access, at least for the LDCs. That is another proposal. Another proposal is that product coverage. This should include all products of export to interest to us, and it should be demand-driven rather than supply-driven. The list of products to enjoy preference in whatever scheme UK comes up with should also come from us as Africa, or yes, the respective countries. We must avoid preference erosion, whereby preferences should be protected from dilution and erosion, and where the preferences given to Africa are more or less given to the rest of the world. At the level, there will cease to be preferences. Our relationship, Africa-UK trade relationship, should encourage and support industrialization and value addition. I know the relationship we've heard was of us selling primary commodities, raw materials to UK and other countries in Europe, for example, coffee, cotton, tea. But now there's been a shift in Africa, and it is the concept under CFTA, industrialization. So if we could add value, investors from UK could come to Uganda, add value. There are a lot of incentives that we can offer. Free land and other benefits for people to invest and add value to the commodities so that we reduce on the trade deficit that exists between Africa and UK. Experience shows that unilateral preferences are problematic. They do not give investors the assurance that they can depend on them into the foreseeable future. Thus, there is need to create an Africa-UK trade relationship that is predictable. I suggest that we consider a negotiated trade arrangement that goes beyond the challenges we had with EPAs. We had some challenges with EPAs. We are still negotiating within it. We've been at that process for so long. We still have some challenges, but we shall overcome. Then another point, Africa-UK trade now and in future should strongly include trade in services. This should have an improved mechanism from the WTO services waiver. In Uganda, we have a national policy on services trade and the national export strategy. Both of these policies consider UK as an important market. But there are challenges or barriers to trade in services that prevent Uganda from exporting services to the UK as envisaged in the above policies. The scheme should ensure that rules of origin are simple and not unnecessarily stringent, because sometimes that is the barrier we have in penetrating some of these markets. Let me talk about the non-tariff barriers. The future Africa trade relations should include a strong commitment to remove non-tariff barriers that deny African countries the opportunity to benefit from preferential market access opportunities. Otherwise, Africa is the destination. It is endowed with all these resources. You look at oil, you look at gold, you look at all this. I know they're capital intensive, but it's the market for you, for UK, and the opportunities are immense. Uganda's vision is to ensure that we consolidate trade with our traditional partners, which are UK, and while we seek new opportunities with others. Please come to Africa and invest in Africa. It's the best opportunities for you. I wish to submit.
Yeah. Thank you, Minister. Just very brief comments. Certainly, I think you've introduced the whole issue about investment into this discussion in a very strong way. That's going to be important for the future. You've talked about services, NTBs. That these are all issues that need to be addressed. And I think you've also affirmed the general view here that in the short term, the UK must maintain market access continuity, including the preferences, which you say are important, and then to look at the new dynamic that is changing in Africa with the regional blocks, the continental market, and so on. We have about 15 minutes left, I believe. And what I'd like to do now is to open up the discussion to the floor to see if this beautiful-looking audience has some questions they would like to put to the panelists. So the floor is open for the next 15 minutes. We'll take all the questions and then give Minister and the other panelists a chance to respond at the end. The floor is open. Yes, Doug. Yeah. Please introduce yourself and your organization.
Good morning. My name is Dirk de Velde and I'm from the Overseas Development Institute in London. Thank you very much for an excellent panel and thank you very much for all the wonderful presentations. It seems to me that there is some consensus around a number of issues, but there's also some thinking where we maybe not yet clear, or at least I'm not yet clear what it looks like. So I think what we're all saying is that it's really important to think around the UK-Africa Trade Partnership as a sort of a comprehensive partnership where trade and investment is really important, both ways, import, export, inward and outward investment, and that's really important. And we'd like to see everything that's being discussed on trade in that wider context. We're also saying that it's really important to avoid a cliff edge. And on day one, something needs to happen in terms of continuity. So I think that's where we are. We're also saying that economic transformation, industrialization, own countries reforms, as you've all here too, is really important as well. And because development, owned policies are key, absolutely key. We then also say that preferences, and I come to my question, but preferences are perhaps one way now, but in the short run are going to be important. There's EBA type of preferences for goods, and there's a services waiver as well that's been discussed. So that's also seen as one way in which that could help, but it's not the end point. Then the end point, I'm not yet clear about what it should look like. So maybe the ambassador could, and maybe also the minister could discuss maybe what should that look like. Is it a giant EPA that we're thinking about between the UK and Africa, for example? Is that an EPA that includes so a free trade agreement between the UK and Africa that is reciprocal, that includes trade and investment and services? Is that what is the end point that you'd like to achieve whenever the CFTA is being fully operational, stage 1 and stage 2 has been achieved, that in 2030 or whatever, that's the end point? Is that what we're looking for? And maybe okay. We can hear on that. Yeah. So where's the ambition, I think? Yeah.
Okay.
That's really.
Thank you very much. We'll park that. What is the end point in all of this? Yes. Why don't we sort of go right through the room? So, yes, I believe that's Andrew. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Mcafee. I'm from the Department for International Development of the UK government, based in the Department for International Trade. Thank you very much for your very candid and erudite points this morning. I can assure you they've been very well received. I'd also like to thank the Ambassador for his tipping his hat towards the UK as a democracy. I think I'm feeling that this morning, in that sometimes when you help fund a study which is respectfully critical of your position, and then you find yourself in front of a panel of very learned experts defending yourselves, you can feel the importance of that democracy and the way that conversation should happen. I wanted to make 3 points, if I may, rather than ask a question. The first is, thank you. We must avoid the disruption of the cliff edge, and I'm very grateful for the acknowledgement of that today. I think our preferences announcement last June was a step forward in demonstrating our commitment to making sure that we would not hit that cliff edge. But there is a long way to go in the negotiations, not only with the WTO, but with our European partners over the next year. And as the ambassador said, there is a very complex variable geometry to negotiate. And so we must make sure that we stay safe in that regard. It's also very important to acknowledge, I think, the importance of the relationship between the UK and Africa. Many of the panelists have noted this, but it's not just about trade, of course. It's important commercially, it's important politically, it's important culturally, and for many in our Houses of Parliament, I can say it's also important personally. And so I just wanted to underline that commitment there to make sure that the future trading relationship should and could be enhanced well over the coming years. And that commitment is there, and in fact it is set out in that white paper that has already been referred to. I came armed with a number of statistics. You have already mentioned many of them, so I won't repeat them. But I think the key question is, as Dirk has said, and as you said, David, is what is next? We need to step up, we need to enhance the relationship, we agree on that. But I would also agree with the Ambassador and the Honourable Minister. Preferences are not the only fruit. There is a wider set of tools and issues that we can call upon and develop together into a more coherent policy over the coming year as we head towards our exit in March 2019. We welcome this debate. We welcome future debates on this. We're willing to work with you on it and to set out the roadmap as suggested. But for now, thank you very much for your comments, and as again I say, they've been very well received.
Okay, thank you too, Andrew. We'll continue to go through the room, and then we'll come back to the front because there were some hands up earlier. I think yes, there, and then after that, Pradeep, you'll be next. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Christoph Bellman from ICTSD. I guess mine is probably a request for clarification, probably from Max. If I understood you correctly, you started by saying, okay, well, we need to avoid the disruptions, and therefore first step is rollover preferences, including FTAs and including the EPAs. To me, that means, well, when you're talking about FTAs, these are reciprocal agreements. So do you mean just the UK unilaterally offering to continue implementing the FTAs, or are we talking about both trade partners agreeing to continue to implement the FTA? And if that's the second case, then you would be in a situation where African countries would continue implementing whatever FTA they have with the UK and continue implementing the EPAs. Meaning, you know, in terms of opening up their markets. So if that's the approach, then I think I understood you. You said, well, we go to the next step, which is strengthening the relationship, and there you propose an enhanced preferential scheme. Now, would that preferential scheme replace those the application of those reciprocal agreements? I don't see how the UK would like to see that. Then what would be really the value added of this enhanced unilateral preference schemes? Wouldn't it be more logical to just replace, you continue implementing your FTAs, your reciprocal FTAs in an interim basis until you replace them with new enhanced reciprocal FTAs, which could be with the whole continent. But I don't really understand how this enhanced preferential schemes would play in.
Okay, thank you very much, Pradeep. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Pradeep Mehta from CUTS. Chiedu, very good morning. I thank you for your motherhood statement about structural reforms, and I must congratulate you that you finally passed your competition law, subject to your, as a major structural reform, subject to your president putting his signature on the dotted line. And considering the political economy in Nigeria or any other country of that kind, I don't know whether there would be any slippages in that the time when the president will put his signature on the dotted line. That said, the bigger point is that even in the Ecowas area, the kind of arrangement that you have, Nigeria doesn't play fair. That is a general point that must be noted. Therefore, when you're looking at, now this is an agreed text where also movement of goods are restricted, particularly food goods, for example, and so on. But I will not get into those details except to make the point that within the agreed text itself, if the member states do not follow it in spirit and letter, then any upward movement in terms of integration in CFTA, etc., would always be a big challenge. And that is Brendan. Morning. Isn't there a discussion? Last question to Brendan and to Max as well. Is there any data? Has anybody disaggregated the data of UK-Africa trade and investment flows as against EU-Africa trade and investment flows? Because we are facing the same problem in the context of India-EU BTA, which is under negotiation for 10 years, and we were then looking at UK also then asking India to sign a separate free trade agreement. And the second question following that, isn't there a discussion on a Commonwealth free trade area? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pradeep. So there was one hand in front, and that will be the last question. We're running out of time to be able to give the panelists a chance to make some final comments.
Thank you. My name is Africa Chiedu. I work with Siatini, and I come from Uganda. Thanks, the panel. When you look at the EPAs, where the UK has been part and parcel of the negotiations, they have been majorly based on timelines, deadlines, rather than the content. And this have not surprised since the initialing of the EPA and to the concluding of the negotiations, the legal scrubbing. It is not surprising that in Ecowas, Nigeria is not yet signed. It's not going to sign. It's not surprising that in the East African community, Tanzania is not going to sign. The issue of bulldozing the African countries into concluding negotiations based on the fact that we should based on timelines. So my question is, and when you look at that whole issue, it goes against the principles of promoting regional integration, which the EPA was promising. Now, what would be the ideal principles, negotiating principles, ideally, that we think the UK Africa new trading relationship would promote? Because we are saying that the UK Africa trade relationship is like an enlargement of the EPA, and the EPA still have left a huge scar on African regional integration, and the experiences are so bad. So what would be the ideal negotiating principles for the Africa-UK trade relationship?
I just wanted to correct something. He said East Africa is not going to sign. That's not true.
No, according to Tanzania, no, I'm saying, according to East African community, Tanzania has indicated that unless the issues it has addressed are signed,
no, we are still negotiating. I
signed.
think you better leave that to the political head. We are still negotiating.
So I think those are the issues that we need to be that they need to be looked at, because it is important to address regional integration, which the EPA tasks to promote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll turn back to the panelists. I'll ask you to respond in the manner or in the order in which you spoke. So we'll start with Max, and then Chiedu, Brendan, and Minister. You would have the opportunity to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the comments. I think there is some agreement, clearly on the things that need to be done. There are a lot of things that are actually many African countries need to do, but they were actually not necessarily with the trade with the UK. Actually, the elements that the ambassador has highlighted basically will be in general of his own, not only trade policy, his own domestic policy in general. And I think it's very important also what the ambassador highlighted of the important political moment in the UK and how this is playing. Actually, there is a lot to think actually of giving the chance actually to the UK actually to do it. It's a very interesting moment. There is a lot of debate, and it's clear there is a vocation from the UK on actually of stepping up that. That is very clear. And the avoiding the cliff edge is sort of the main thing, and everyone is on board on that. So I think there is a lot of pieces to put. Actually, I think probably it's an issue of sequencing mostly of that. I think specifically on the point, I mean, that was addressed to me, I think there are two things to highlight. First is that the UK cannot negotiate now until 2019. So basically it is the option that the UK has given to not only African countries, but with any country that the UK has a free trade agreement, is until 2019, if we want to avoid a change at a cliff edge, not only in Africa but with any country, is actually rolling over the existing agreements, and that will include EPAs, and that is based on the fact that the UK cannot negotiate on its own until March 2019, until Brexit Day, and still unclear whether that period will extend it depending on the implementation of the implementation of the transitional agreement out of the EU. And specifically on the sort of sequence is, yes, I mean, you're right that it may mean a change in the market access of the UK into some of the African countries. However, we trust that considering that in the EPAs, African countries, ACP countries in general, they managed to exclude 20% of products that clearly exclude most of the trade of the EU or the UK with the African countries. So in terms of effect, in terms of market access of the UK into African countries, the effect is expected to be minimal of actually if that market access is eliminated. I think that these sort of preferences may work into a sort of transition until Africa, for example, prepares its own integration strategy, etc., and that may lead into a, I don't know the timings, but after that, into a sort of potential free trade agreement for the whole continent. That could be an option, but it could be other elements that could be considered. But always, I agree that this should be beyond preferences. It should include elements associated with investment, services, NTVs, etc., going for a more, rather than just a shallow agreement, going for a deeper integration agreement between the UK and Africa.
Okay, thank you, Max. Chiedu?
Thank you. The questions, as I understood them, question number one was, what next? I would say it as follows. Because we are dealing with lots of uncertainties, lots of factors that are not constants but variables, my answer to that would be monitor, evaluate, analyze, keep it under review. There's a role for the African Union Commission. There's a role for UNECA. There's a role for individual national trade authorities. So in terms of next steps, have a trade policy relevant process that keeps the UK-Africa relationship under constant review, and we'll see. It's the answer, I don't believe, is ex ante. You can't tell that now. Second question, as I understood it, was what would the final product look like? We're uncertain, but it would depend. We're trying to answer the same question with the Americans relative to AGOA when the renewal comes to an end in 2025. We're uncertain about the United Kingdom. It could be a range of anything. It could be an MOU, it could be an FTA, it could be a trade agreement. We don't know. If we're not able to answer question number one with certainty, we will not be able to answer question two with certainty. But there's a huge range of instruments that we could use as an outcome. I think, again, we have to wait and see. Number 3, there was a question from my friend Pradip regarding Ecowas and regional integration. I think the Nigerians have got their attention and they've got their focus. They're moving on regional integration. I believe the president will sign as soon as possible the competition law, bring it into effect rather quickly. It's important. There's a lot that's going on in Nigeria with regard to an enabling environment for business, improving the ease of doing business, you know, and it's beginning to show results. But it's not so much about Nigeria, the point of it being to accompany trade policy and to reap the gains from trade. If there are no accompanying domestic structural reforms, it won't work. It's simply not going to work. And then the last point I would like to make is on the CFTA and how it has a bearing on all this. My starting point really is, under 2 weeks ago, we were all in Niamey, and it was the leadership and the courage, the determination of decisions that were made by ministers like Minister Amelia Kyambadde, who is here, that took the CFTA through a turning point. We made a turning point in Niamey, and I'd like to pay tribute, put it on the record here, to the Ugandan trade minister who played a key role. So what happens in the CFTA will matter, and I'm underscoring the point she made. What happens regionally in the 7 regional economic communities, and she mentioned East Africa, will matter. A lot of that is still in a dynamic process, as Minister Kyambadde has pointed out, and we'll have to wait and see. There is so much that's going on in terms of structural dynamics that there are questions we will not be able to answer now. The only people who can answer it will be, you know, the consultants and the talking heads who feel that they have it all figured out. It is not all figured out. It isn't. This is a very, very dynamic process. The chips are on the table, but we have to be intelligent enough to know that even we cannot see the stars at this time, but we know the direction in which we are headed. I think the last point was just to be clear on where Nigeria is on the EPA. Nigeria will neither sign nor ratify the Economic Partnership Agreement, simply because for Nigeria, it's yesterday's way of doing trade. In the next couple of days here in Buenos Aires, Nigeria will sign an agreement with EFTA. It will include goods, services, and Minister Kyambadde mentioned that, intellectual property, investment. We're looking at areas of customs cooperation and trade facilitation. It's about modernizing our economies. It's about empowering women that constitute a huge part of the informal sector. Would like to bring women in and do much more than we're doing to bring them into the formal economy. These are areas in which we will be pushing. And it's about, it's exactly what the Ugandan distinguished minister pointed about. It's about structural transformation, modernization, and industrialization. And I'll leave it at that. Okay. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Chiedu. Can I assure you there are no talking heads here?
No, not here.
Not here.
Not here.
Just briefly in response to Pradeep's question, I think Brexit has renewed some interest in the prospects or potential of a Commonwealth-wide FTA. One member state actually proposed further work on this at the recent Working Group on Trade and Investment. But I think realistically, given the different levels of development and economic interests, this is going to be extremely difficult to achieve. On a more legal and technical note, 2 remaining EU member states, Malta and Cyprus, are also members of the Commonwealth, so they don't have the authority to negotiate trade agreements. Just on the question of the trade data, you know, we have looked at that as well. UK is not always the most important EU importer for most of sub-Saharan African countries, but it is an important market for particular products. But if you take a bit of a twist on this question, and also Christoph's observation, I think it's also important to bear in mind that the EU will be losing its second largest economy. The UK contributes around 17% of EU GDP. So the economic partnership agreements minus the UK means a smaller EU 27 market with related trade flows. So what we've also been hearing from some of our member states, that this may upset the balance of concessions and commitments that have been made if some countries that have a large trade exposure to the UK would be losing that market but have reciprocated considerably domestically. So that's also something that one needs to think about. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan.
Yes.
Minister, you have the last word.
Yes, I'll just respond to 2 points, and I'll make my final point on the last one, on the third point. Well, talking about data between UK and some countries in Africa is on a variable geometry in most cases, because even though it's been under EU, it's been trading with some of these countries directly. For example, like in Uganda would export, there is a trade imbalance. In 2016, we exported about goods worth 16.5 million, which is very little, and imported goods worth 75 million US dollars in 2016. Of course, there is a terrible imbalance, and that is something we want to look at, and that's why we're talking about adding value. So you find that this data mainly is on a variable geometry basis. On the issue of APAS, ESC is still negotiating, and the chair of ESC, who is the president of Uganda, would like us all to sign together. But some countries have already signed, but a number of issues have come up, and post-Brexit is one of the issues that has affected the imbalance of the negotiations. So it is very high on the agenda. It's one of the issues. How are we going to relate with EPAs when there is Brexit? Another issue has been the rendezvous clause. Well, how do we depart? If you want to depart as a country, can you do that? Another one is protection of the infant industries. So we are still negotiating as ESC and EPAs. Recently, about 2 months ago, the president of Uganda met President Juncker of EU to see how we can, whether they have responses to some of these issues. Finally, I'd like to thank UK. UK has made a number of interventions in some countries, for example, like East Africa, to improve on trade, or to ease the doing of business, or to reduce on the cost of doing business. They have worked on the border posts, e-single window, cargo tracking, NTB mechanism, and a number of other projects in the entire East Africa. And I'm sure they're also doing it elsewhere. But this has reduced on the NTBs. It has at least promoted East African integration. So we're really looking forward to improving our trade between UK and East Africa. I wish to submit. I thank you for organizing this forum.
Yes, and thank you too, Minister. I noticed we're over time, but yes, you ended on a very positive note that UK interventions have made a difference, and going forward, this is what we're hoping to achieve through this collaboration between ECA and ODI in interrogating these issues. Of course, we cannot answer all the questions with finality today, because as has been noted, there's still a number of moving parts. But our objective actually as both ODI and ECA is to bring these issues out for open discussion, as we've had this morning, and above all to ensure that Africa is not forgotten as these dynamics unfold in the UK. So thank you very much. I think it has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good. It's very good on the Excellent.